The Omega-9 nuclear power plant stood silent on the banks of the icy river, gray smoke rising, dissolving into the cold sky. It was a miniature city, chimneys, conduits, control rooms, operating like the heart of Titan, growling beneath the metallic pulse. That day, the winter wind blew along the steel corridors. In the central control room, fluorescent lights illuminated stern faces. The row of screens flickered with temperature, pressure, and humidity readings, the living data of the reactor. Every number was under control, or at least, that's what they believed. Ethan Cross, the operations chief, stood with arms crossed before the control panel. His eyes were as sharp as an old knife, honed each night. He had worked here for 27 years. He had witnessed even the smallest incidents, seen colleagues lose their lives to carelessness. For Ethan, the system was God. Humans were just a tiny part. A single misstep could cost the entire plant. In a corner of the control room, Emily Brooks, a young woman with hastily tied brown hair and determined black eyes, knelt down to inspect the technical panel. An old backpack with frayed straps rested by her feet. In her hands, a voltmeter beeped steadily. Each beep was the breath of Titan, a sound only those patient enough could truly discern. A tall engineer, Ryan, who always prided himself as the lead engineer, glanced over, frowning. "Hey, don't fuss around down there. The system is automatically monitored. You just need to dust it off." Emily didn't look up. Her fingers traced along the seams of the panel. This conduit wasn't in the latest schematics. Tiny, bright sparks danced. She knew even the smallest gap could awaken Titan, and no one would be able to stop it. She carefully removed the plastic casing from a wire. The voltage reading showed only 0.02 V, below the alarm threshold. But Emily remembered, in the old manual she studied last night, that this discrepancy could be an early sign of a slow radioactive leak. She stood up and walked over to Ethan. "Mr. Ethan, I found an interference signal in the auxiliary panel of Unit B. It's small, but..." Ethan didn't take his eyes off the main screen, where the reactor core temperature remained steady. He cut her off, his voice flat as an order. "If it's not past the alert threshold, it's nothing. Don't make a fuss here." Emily fell silent. In the dim green light, her face betrayed nothing, but her eyes drooped slightly. She knew. Here. Everyone heard the voice of the system, but they couldn't hear Titan's whispers. Beneath the plant, Titan still growled. The cooling water cycled endlessly. Pressure valves clicked thump, thump, steadily. A sound enough to lull the complacent and awaken those sensitive enough. Emily put away the voltmeter, carefully stepped back. Alone, she sat in the corner on a wooden chair, jotting down every reading in her notebook. She didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but she knew someone had to record it. In her notebook, she wrote, "Bazuro, 2V, very small interference, feels abnormal. Recheck tomorrow, Titan is whispering." And so, in the cold of the control room, Titan's breath still echoed, and that small girl quietly took the first step in a battle no one else could see. The afternoon dragged on, heavy like a block of lead suspended above the plant's domes. The fluorescent light still flickered steadily, casting a stark glow on the tense faces, even as the snow outside turned to wet, gray slush. Ethan Cross stood before the central control panel, hands clasped tight, his gaze locked on the main screen. He was like a seasoned captain who had steered this ship through countless storms, always believing that only discipline and procedure could keep it afloat. Ethan knew every pump's hum, every dancing number on the screens. He was part of the system, and the system was part of his own blood and bones. There was no room for error here, because even a single crack and Titan would ignite, burning every arrogant soul in its path. In the corner, Emily Brooks, the maintenance assistant he only knew by name, remained silent. Her coat was frayed at the shoulders, the voltmeter resting on her lap. She scribbled quickly, her small writing neat and precise. Ethan glanced at her, an expression of half contempt, half suspicion. This young woman wasn't on the official roster he received that morning. Just a name on a temporary file, Emily Brooks, technical contract, maintenance. For Ethan, that wasn't a voice worth hearing. Ryan, the lead engineer, leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers on the control console. He shot a glance at Ethan, as if to remind him, "Don't let her be a distraction. The system's still green. We can't let small things disrupt the protocol." Ethan nodded, silent. But deep down, a small part of him, the instinct of an old operator, still noticed Emily's expression. No arrogance, none of the rush of paranoid minds, only a frightening patience. Across the room, Lucas, a young engineer newly hired 2 years ago, sat between two auxiliary screens. He monitored every parameter: reactor core temperature, the conductivity of the cooling water, steam pipe pressure. Lucas always reminded himself to stay loyal to the system, where everything was digitized, where there was no room for feelings or intuition. But Lucas's gaze sometimes drifted to Emily. He had heard her voice this morning. 02V interference signal, and deep down, Lucas felt a flicker of unease. It was small, but not meaningless. He remembered his old teacher's words, the first gut feeling. Sometimes that's the only thing that can save us. But who dares to listen to it when facing their superiors? Lucas's hands tightened, his eyes wavering. He didn't have the courage to speak up, but he wasn't cold enough to dismiss the small girl either. In the control room, the hum of the ventilation fans droned like a lullaby. The supervisors passed by, each holding a clipboard, eyes cold as steel. They all carried the same pride. We are Omega 9, the pinnacle of absolute safety. But that very pride was a stone wall. Emily touched it every time she spoke, and each time her words seemed to fall into an abyss. She kept writing, her hand trembling lightly from the cold. Lucas looked up, wanting to ask her a question. Just one question. Why are you so sure it's dangerous? But the words caught in his throat. Because he knew, just by speaking them, he would cross the line between occupational safety and conscience-driven responsibility. Suddenly, a soft click sounded from the auxiliary panel, like a hiccup in Titan's sleep. Emily looked up immediately, her eyes locked. She glanced at the voltmeter, B0.023V, just a slight uptick, but enough for her to know Titan was no longer at rest. She took a deep breath, tapped her fingers against the old plastic casing of the voltmeter. A quiet promise to herself. If no one listens, I'll still speak, because Titan doesn't joke. And so, in the green-lit control room, Emily, the nameless girl, had begun a silent battle. In the corner, Lucas frowned, his heart beating fast. Ethan Cross stood before the main screen, unaware of an invisible crack slowly spreading through his proud silence. Beneath the Omega 9 plant, hot pipes snaked like veins. The sound of the pumps pushing cooling water, the hiss of pressure valves, a metallic symphony. Emily Brooks walked down the narrow corridor, her small flashlight sweeping across moldy patches on the steel walls. In her worn protective suit, she looked like a stray figure among the warning signs. Danger, high radiation, hanging on the walls. But Emily wasn't afraid. She knew Titan was only dangerous if ignored. She knelt beside an old technical junction box, the silver paint peeling. At that moment, the hiss of boiling water from overhead pipes echoed down, the acrid smell of hot metal in the air. Emily removed her fabric gloves, her fingers lightly brushing the steel surface, thick with dust, but beneath it, she felt a faint crack. She pulled out her old voltmeter from her pocket. The flashlight's beam wavered with each breath, reflecting on the dim LED screen. The leakage current had only risen by 0.003V, not enough to trigger the automatic sensors. But Emily knew, these tiny cracks were Titan's first whispers. She opened her notebook, writing slowly. Auxiliary junction box, small crack, silver paint peeling, signal 3.3V, faint burnt smell. The ballpoint pen scratched across the paper, in the heat and Titan's growl. It was the only sound that proved she still heard life. Above, the control room was still lit. Ryan lounged in his chair, fingers swiping across the touchscreen. Temperature stable. Pressure stable. Radiation within limits. Everything normal. A dangerous illusion. Ethan Cross sat at the main control console. In his mind, everything remained orderly. Titan was asleep. Nothing to worry about. Part of him trusted the system. The rest stayed silent, because that silence was safe. Emily unscrewed the box cover, revealing cables twisted like dry roots. One section had turned black, a sign of long-term oxidation. She slipped her fingers in, feeling lightly, the insulation brittle and ready to crumble. It's rotting from the inside, she thought, her heart racing. She pulled out her phone to take a photo, the flash flaring, a tiny spark of light in the darkness. She knew this image wouldn't convince anyone, not serious enough to break the control room's complacency, but she did it anyway, because Titan had spoken to her through that tiny crack. When Emily returned to the hallway, sweat beaded on her temple. She adjusted her backpack and walked quickly back to the control room. On the way, Lucas, the young engineer, was checking a pressure valve. He looked up, seeing her face smeared with dust. "Where are you going? Down there." His voice was low, but with a rare hint of worry. "I heard something the system hasn't heard yet." Emily's voice was firm, unwavering. Lucas was silent. He saw her gaze, deep and calm, like the bottom of a pool. He knew, if she was right, everything he believed in might shatter. But deep down, he wanted her to be right, because only she dared to listen to Titan when it whispered. When Emily entered the control room, Ethan Cross was receiving a report from the safety office. A supervisor's voice echoed steadily. "No radiation leak detected. The system remains stable." Ethan nodded, as if stamping the trust of the entire plant. He looked at Emily, half mocking. "What did you see down there? Your Titan is still asleep, isn't it?" Emily didn't answer. She opened her notebook, placing it in front of him. "I saw a crack in the auxiliary junction box of Unit B. If it spreads, if... Ethan cut her off. "We don't work with ifs. We work with numbers." She sighed softly, closing her notebook. In the green light of the control room, Ethan looked up at the screen, no longer looking at her, but Lucas, in the corner of the room, had started to wonder. Maybe, this time, if isn't something small. Evening fell over the Omega-9 plant like a thick curtain, hiding the sickly yellow light of the long corridors. In the small canteen beside the control room, the smell of fried rice and machine oil mixed, casting a false warmth. Ryan, the lead engineer, sat with a group of colleagues. They ate dinner and joked, voices mocking. "What's that contract girl doing down in the technical bay, planning to reinvent nuclear engineering?" Another laughed loudly, the sound carrying like a dismissal. If there were any real danger, the alarm would be blaring by now. Don't let outsiders mess things up. They didn't know, or didn't want to know, that beneath their feet, Titan still rumbled, each breath hotter, longer. Lucas sat at another table, holding a cup of hot tea but not drinking. His ears caught every jest, his heart heavy as lead. He didn't know which side to stand on. The control room, where he was trained, where his salary and stability lived, or the strange young woman with the calm, certain gaze. He remembered Emily's face, hidden behind dust. He remembered her hand holding the voltmeter, trembling slightly, but still gripping tight. If she's right, if Titan is really waking up, then those laughs will turn to cries. In a small office above the canteen, Ethan Cross sat alone. Before him lay the operations report, columns of green numbers, clean, just as upper management liked it. Ethan poured himself a cup of strong tea. He believed in procedures, more than in people. For too many years, he had seen colleagues lose their lives to a moment of panic. A reactor only needs calm, not people who say, if. But a part of Ethan couldn't ignore the distant memory, the 2002 leak. Back then, it was a maintenance worker who saved the entire shift because he heard an unusual hiss in the pipes. But that same incident taught Ethan to distrust intuition. He only trusted the numbers. After dinner, Emily returned to the technical bay. Under the dim light, she checked every joint, noting each worn mark on the steel pipes. Sweat ran down her spine, the heat pressing into her face. A safety engineer passed by, squinting at her. "What are you still fussing with? At this hour, who cares about that junk?" Emily just bowed her head, not answering. She knew they laughed, but Titan didn't laugh. Titan only whispered, and only those patient enough to listen could understand that whisper was a threat. When Emily returned to the control room, the atmosphere had calmed. The laughter had dwindled to small talk. Lucas caught her eye, a look not of hostility, just curiosity. "Why aren't you afraid of their mockery?" Emily answered softly. "They laugh because they think Titan isn't waking up. But Titan doesn't care. When it does wake, it won't give them time to cry." She placed her notebook on the control console. A supervisor passed by, chuckling sarcastically. "Writing a novel? For late-night entertainment, huh?" Lucas tightened his grip on the cup of tea. He knew she wasn't writing a novel. She was recording Titan's whispers, the words no one wanted to hear. In the technical bay, the temperature rose slowly, not fast enough for the alarms to trigger, but enough for anyone who truly knew the system to sense. Titan was shifting. Steam hissed through the pipes, the metallic smell thick as iron and blood. Emily bent down, feeling that breath through her fingertips. She knew, tonight, only she was truly listening, and she would not turn away. Night had fallen, its chill slithering through Omega-9's metal hallways. In that space, the sound of circulating pumps still beat steadily like Titan's secret heart. Emily Brooks stood before a small door in the basement, the technical archive room, where old blueprints and yellowing papers slept. At Omega-9, where everything was constantly modernized, this room was a relic. Who still cared about dusty sheets when the digital system had everything? But Emily didn't trust the system. She trusted what she could touch with her hands. She pushed open the door, the neon light flickering weakly. A musty smell rose up, mixing with old paper. Steel filing cabinets lined the walls, their hinges groaning as Emily pulled one open. She found the file marked Unit B, Original Drawings, 2008. Her fingers ran across the thick pages. Blue ink smudged. Each line was like part of Titan's bloodstream. Emily found a wiring diagram she had checked today. An auxiliary circuit once labeled to monitor high corrosion risk. Tiny writing, faded ink. 2011, recheck after 10 years. Emily's breath quickened. This was the 13th year. No one had come back to check. She flipped more pages. A 2012 pressure test report, neatly folded at the back. In it, a small note. Leakage 0. EWOS 1V, below alarm threshold. No action required, per ISO 1297. Emily frowned. She understood. That was how the system erased danger. If it didn't meet the threshold, it didn't exist. But Titan didn't care about ISO standards. It only needed a crack to show its fury. The neon light flickered, a brief blackout like a ragged breath. Emily photographed every page, her hands shaking slightly from the cold. She whispered to herself, I can't be wrong. If I'm wrong, Titan won't give me a chance to fix it. In the corner, another cabinet stood slightly ajar. She glanced inside, the 2002 incident report, the radiation leak that almost became a disaster. In that report, she saw a name. Initial discoverer, David Miller, maintenance worker. A nobody, with no seat in the control room, but he had saved the entire plant. Emily tucked the documents into a small cloth bag, closing the cabinet. Before leaving, she looked back at the room where Titan had spoken to those willing to listen. In the thick dampness of old paper, she found her faith. Not the system, not the control seats. It's the quiet ones who truly hear Titan when it whispers. She stepped out into the hallway. The sound of the pump still drummed steadily, like a lullaby in steel. But to her, every beat was no longer calm. It was a reminder. Time was running out. Outside, the winter wind howled like Titan's moaning as night fell. The cold crept through every crack in the steel doors, clinging to the gutters and steel stairs, turning them into icy blades. Inside the Omega-9 plant, night only made everything quieter, heavier. Emily Brooks pulled her coat tighter, holding the cloth bag of old documents close. The faint yellow light illuminated her cheeks, revealing the dark circles under her eyes, marks of many sleepless nights. She knew she had crossed the line of contract technician, but if she didn't speak, Titan would speak for her. In an explosion no one could stop. Lucas left the main control room and stepped into the hallway. He saw Emily leaning against the wall, head bowed, clutching the file. You're still here? At this hour, only the night shift remains? His voice was low, but without any doubt now. Emily looked up. Her gaze, in the dim hallway light, was quiet yet resolute. I found it in the old records, the circuit I mentioned. It was flagged more than 10 years ago. No one ever checked it again. Lucas held his breath. He reached out to the file she held. The pages were worn at the corners, the blue ink numbers jagged like scars on Titan's body. Are you sure? He asked softly. Sure. I can hear it groaning, in every circuit, in the heat rising from the pipes, Emily replied, her voice calm to the point of fear. Lucas flipped through the pages, seeing coffee stains, stamped words, temporarily safe, no action needed. He swallowed hard. Something inside him wavered, the trust in the system's perfection he'd always believed unshakable. Do you know, if you're wrong, if Titan is still asleep? He hesitated. I know. Emily exhaled, a cloud of white in the cold air. But if I'm right, no one will have time to laugh anymore. She looked him straight in the eyes. For a moment, Lucas saw in her a terrifying calm, the calm of someone who knew she'd never be believed, but had to speak anyway. I'll help you, Lucas said, his voice firmer than he expected. At the very least, I can recheck the pipes, see if what you're saying is true. Emily nodded. They walked side by side down the hallway, the yellow lights casting their long shadows behind them like two silent warriors. They passed by the digital data archive, the room where the central computer stored real-time thermal maps of the whole plant. Lucas quietly used his access card to unlock deeper permissions. On the screen, the pipes appeared like the veins of a giant, a red dot blinking slowly at the area Emily had mentioned. Here, Lucas pointed at the 3D map. The temperature at the main valve cluster of Unit B is slightly higher than normal. Not an alarm yet, but it could be from a minor leak. He turned to look at Emily. For the first time, there was no outsider look, only a teammate. "We need more evidence," he said. "If there's one last step before Titan wakes. I'll take it with you." Emily nodded slightly, clutching the document bag tighter. In the freezing silence, they could both hear Titan's low growl, the sound everyone else ignored, but only they listened to. Destanidokit the next morning, the Omega-9 canteen was filled with the clinking of spoons and bowls, the smell of hot porridge, toasted bread, and industrial oil mingled everywhere. Ryan sat with the group of supervisors, his laugh as loud as the night before. "Hey, did anyone see that prophet from last night? Still fussing with that old voltmeter, right?" Ryan snickered, drumming his fingers on the table. A young engineer chimed in, laughing along. "Probably writing her next novel now. Titan, midnight horror story." Laughter erupted, echoing under the cold steel ceiling. But deep in that laughter, a few eyes flickered away. Because they all knew something wasn't right. Lucas sat silently, the bowl of porridge in front of him grown cold. He looked over to see Emily sitting in a far corner, still in her faded coat, notebook before her. Untouched food. "Hey, Lucas!" Ryan clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't let those silly stories get to you. We're here for the procedure. Don't let emotions sway you." Lucas nodded, but didn't answer. In his mind, the image of the thermal map from last night still haunted him. The red dot blinking, not screaming, but still there, like a silent, flowing vein. He glanced at Emily, her eyes fixed on her notebook, as if every word was a breath of Titan itself. East in the control tower, Ethan Cross was reviewing the morning safety report. The indicators were still green, everything stable. He tapped his fountain pen on the table, the sound echoing like his own heartbeat. A supervisor stepped in, placing a supplemental report on the table. "Mr. Cross, there's a rumor of an abnormal signal at Unit B. Emily Brooks, contract technician, she said." Ethan looked up, his eyes cold as a blade. "I don't want to hear rumors. We work with official data only." "Now, yes, but..." The other man hesitated. "No buts!" Ethan lowered his voice, emphasizing each word. "Anyone who oversteps their authority will be held responsible." The other man left. No one spoke of it again. But Ethan knew. Silence did not mean safety. He felt an invisible crack spreading across the faces around him. After breakfast, Emily gathered her notebook and slowly left. The mocking laughter behind her persisted, but it no longer touched her. She only heard Titan's voice, the heat circulating through the conduits, the faint groan of metal as it expanded. Lucas caught up, placing a hand on her shoulder, speaking softly. "They don't understand, but I believe something isn't right." Emily looked at him, her eyes still bright despite the fatigue on her face. "They don't need to believe. Titan doesn't need anyone to believe. It just needs to be heard." Yitei. In the afternoon, gray clouds blanketed the Omega-9 plant like a heavy quilt. In the main control room, rows of screens blinked with pale blue light. The steady heartbeat of Titan maintained an outward calm. Ethan Cross stood before the control panel, eyes fixed on the temperature chart. He was like a rock, unmoved by any wave of rumors. "Pressure is stable, no alerts," he murmured, his voice firm. The control room door opened, and Emily Brooks entered. Her coat was still speckled with technical dust, a crossbody backpack, and she clutched a folder of old documents. The fluorescent light shone on her sweat-dappled forehead, but her voice did not waver. "Mr. Ethan," she spoke, steady and firm. "I have evidence. The crack in the auxiliary electrical box of Unit B has been neglected for 10 years. Old data confirms the risk of slow corrosion. If we don't inspect it immediately, Titan won't wait for us to escape." Ethan Cross turned, his gaze sharp as a blade. "I don't have time for emotional hypotheses. Here, we work with the system. You're not part of operations. Don't overstep your boundaries." Ryan, the chief engineer, leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Emily, who are you? A short-term contractor trying to preach to us? Everything here is under control." Emily didn't look at Ryan. Her gaze remained fixed on Ethan, unwavering. "I'm not speaking to scare. I found the 2012 pressure test report. You signed off as stable without reinspection. And now, I see a red dot. Abnormal temperature at the main valve of Unit B." Ethan Cross narrowed his eyes, a flicker of confusion passing through. But then he clenched his jaw. "Are you accusing me? Do you know the consequences of spreading baseless rumors?" The control room fell silent. The screens still blinked blue. The stable numbers seemed to challenge human resolve. But within each person, a crack had begun to spread. Ryan broke the silence, his tone sarcastic. "Are we going to report the feelings of these two to the higher-ups? They'll laugh in our faces." Emily shook her head, her voice calm. "I don't need anyone to laugh. I just need Titan to be heard before it roars beyond control." Ethan looked at Emily for a long time. Finally, he took a deep breath, his voice hoarse. "I'll reinspect the main valve of Unit B, but you, don't act on your own. If I find this is just a scare tactic, you won't set foot in this plant again." Emily nodded. "I understand." Under the cold green light, two people, a petite girl and a seasoned engineer, faced each other. Between them was no longer a hierarchy, but a bigger question. Do we choose to trust the numbers or the whispers of Titan? As evening fell, the sunset cast through the dusty glass windows, tinting the control room corridor a cold gray-orange. Inside, the clatter of keyboards, the hum of ventilation fans, yet behind that peaceful facade, Titan had begun to stir. Emily Brooks stood by a narrow window, eyes following the massive smokestack, releasing thin white smoke into the sky. She clutched her notebook tightly, the pages flipping gently in the cold breeze. Beside her, Lucas sat pensively, his eyes no longer avoiding, but filled with empathy and concern. Suddenly, a dry crack sounded somewhere in the conduit network, small, but enough for all the on-duty engineers to look up. The warning screen remained silent, signal light still green, but anyone with years of experience knew Titan had breathed more heavily than usual. Lucas jumped up, running to the auxiliary control panel. His eyes quickly scanned the data lines. Pressure dipped slightly, then returned. A red streak blinked for a second, then disappeared. "See that?" he whispered, turning to Emily. Emily nodded, her face pale. "That's it." A breath, Titan is no longer asleep. Ethan Cross pushed his chair back, gripping the armrest tightly. He maintained a calm demeanor, but in his seasoned eyes, a flicker of doubt passed like a breeze. No alert triggered, all data still within safety. He spoke slowly, as if reassuring himself. Ryan, the chief engineer, frowned but forced a smile. Perhaps just metal expansion due to temperature change. It's common. But Emily shook her head. No, that crack isn't a random sound. It's Titan signaling. The shell is tiring. She placed her hand on the table edge, her voice resolute. If we don't inspect immediately, there will be a second, a third, and then Titan's roar. The room fell silent. The ventilation fan's hum suddenly sounded like a groan. Lucas took a deep breath, hands clasped. I agree with Emily. At least, we must directly inspect the auxiliary electrical box, the main valve of Unit B. Ryan pressed his lips together, but said nothing more. Ethan Cross slowly turned, his gaze seeming to pierce through the concrete wall. He was accustomed to making decisions based on numbers, but now he sensed a small crack in his belief. He nodded slowly. All right, I authorize a manual inspection of the main valve. But Emily, you go with Lucas. I'll monitor from here. Beneath the stairs leading to the basement, Emily and Lucas donned thick protective gear. The helmet-mounted flashlights cast weak beams, illuminating the rusted steel walls. Their footsteps echoed dryly, small sounds amidst Titan's heavy growls. Heat blew against their faces, moisture condensing on their visor lenses. Emily gripped the measuring device tightly, lips pressed firmly. In the reactor's darkness, there was no room for hesitation. Lucas walked beside her, his eyes no longer fearful, but determined. He knew this was the boundary between an operations engineer and a Titan guardian. They stopped before the auxiliary electrical box, where Emily had first touched the crack. She bent down, inserting the voltage probe into the fissure. A beeping sound echoed, small but steady, Ju-26V. Just a slight deviation, but enough to make Titan shudder. Emily breathed slowly, her hand gripping the device tightly. We must report this, right now. Her voice rose, even if just a whisper. In the darkness, Lucas nodded. Heat radiated from the conduits, passing through their hands, like Titan's breath, slow, terrifying, and never deceitful. Beneath Omega-9's ground, the technical basement was as hot as an oven. The sound of circulating water, the pump's screech, and the heat emitted from the pipes, all merged into a hurried symphony. Emily and Lucas stood before the auxiliary electrical box, their eyes fixed on the measuring device screen. The Ju-26V flickered. Not a large number, but for them, it was Titan's awakening signal. We can't delay any longer. Emily exhaled deeply, her voice unusually calm. I'll report directly to the Nuclear Safety Commission. Lucas swallowed hard, nodding. He knew this action could bury his budding career, but he had no choice. I'll support you. If they don't listen, at least, we've done everything we could. Suddenly, a sound echoed, crack, snap, as if metal was being bent, but resonating throughout the conduits. The temperature in the technical area rose by 0.5 degrees within seconds. Emily looked up, her eyes darkening. It's cracking. Titan has begun to breathe more heavily. Lucas shuddered. For the first time, he felt the colossal life hidden beneath steel and concrete. No longer were they cool green numbers, but the groans of a compressed monster. They returned to the control room, two sweat-soaked figures, their steps resolute. Ethan Cross was conversing with the supervisory board via radio. Seeing them, he frowned. Report. Emily placed the measuring device on the table, opened her notebook. Rapid temperature increase. Interference signals rising. The system doesn't alert because thresholds aren't exceeded. But that's Titan's signal. We must shut down Unit B immediately. A supervisor standing next to Ethan shook his head. You say must, but based on what? Such minor signals aren't grounds to shut down the entire system. The consequences would be millions of dollars and a complete disruption of the operational schedule. Emily didn't blink. Based on Titan's breath, based on the truth you don't want to see. Ethan looked at Lucas, as if testing him one last time. Do you believe what she's saying, Lucas? Lucas swallowed hard, his hand gripping the edge of the table. The heat still lingered on his shoulders. He remembered the crack in the darkness, remembered Emily's unblinking eyes as she listened to Titan's breath. I believe, he said, and I will sign to confirm. The control room fell silent. Ryan, the chief engineer, exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. But Ethan's eyes remained fixed on Lucas. Finally, he nodded slowly. All right, I will order the shutdown of Unit B, but only after I see it with my own eyes. You two come with me. They descended into the technical basement once more. This time, Ethan Cross led the way, with Emily and Lucas following. Their footsteps echoed, mingling with the heat and Titan's low growl, a growl still restrained, but no longer unfamiliar. Ethan bent down to inspect the electrical box, the very spot Emily had indicated. His fingers touched the rough casing, heat rising through his gloves. I hear it, he exclaimed, for the first time, his aged eyes reflecting fear. Emily looked at him, saying nothing. Lucas placed a hand on his shoulder, affirming, There's no time. Ethan took a deep breath, stood upright. In the dim flashlight, he gestured decisively. Shut down Unit B. Call the emergency inspection team. Upon returning to the control room, Ethan Cross was no longer the proud man from the morning. His voice was deep and firm. Initiate immediate shutdown of Unit B. Activate emergency safety mode. A long siren blared. Red warning lights flashed on the control panel, not from the automated system, but from the final human who dared to trust Titan. In that space, Emily and Lucas stood side by side, the two quietest individuals who had dared to speak up. And outside the glass window, Titan still breathed, but tonight it was finally heard. The long siren echoed, piercing through steel corridors and thick concrete layers, like Titan's own warning. In the control room, red lights blinked rhythmically, an urgent heartbeat that could no longer be ignored. Ethan Cross stood tall, holding the radio. Activate emergency safety mode for Unit B. Emergency inspection team, take your positions immediately. His voice was hoarse and resolute. No more doubt, only the worry evident on his forehead, sweat streaming down his temples. In the technical basement, the emergency inspection team appeared, clad in thick protective gear, flashlights casting bright beams on damp steel walls. They moved swiftly, no longer mocking as they did the night before, only focused, with eyes tense like steel wires. Lucas led, pointing to the conduit wall. Here, auxiliary electrical box of Unit B, interference signal is increasing. Another engineer shone a light for a closer look. He trembled upon seeing the insulation layer beginning to peel. My God! The casing is almost entirely corroded. On the control screen, the temperature graph began to fluctuate. Titan had lost patience, heat spreading rapidly, pushing pressure up like a rising tide. Emily clutched her notebook, eyes fixed on the screen. In her mind, every line she had written became a breath, no longer just evidence, but survival. We have only a few minutes left. she whispered. Ethan Cross heard clearly, nodding slowly. He turned to the supervisor. Cut power supply to Unit B, manually. If the system doesn't respond... A loud bell rang. Level 2 alert. Abnormal temperature and pressure. That bell tore through any remaining confidence. Ryan turned pale, his lips quivering. Why is it happening so fast? Lucas clenched his fists. Titan never waits for anyone. Either we shut it down, or it consumes us. Ethan gave the final order. Open emergency release valves. Emergency team, prepare for chain reaction suppression. The hiss of steam valves echoed, long hissing sounds like Titan's roar. In that moment, all eyes focused on the trembling hands of the technical team, those who dared to step into Titan's shadow. Yui in the control room, Emily stood silently, her face pale. She knew, just a few minutes later, no one would have had the chance to stand here. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, for the first time no longer the cold shift leader, but a grateful human. Thank you for not staying silent. Emily gasped, not replying. Her eyes met Lucas's. He responded with a small, firm nod. They didn't speak, but understood. We did everything, even when no one wanted to believe. As the main release valve opened fully, heat vented out, gradually lowering the core temperature. Red lights on the control panel still blinked, but now they signaled hope, no longer death. Titan had been soothed. In the suffocating space of the control room, there was no longer mocking laughter, only the silence of those who had experienced the fragile moment between life and death. Yes, das. The heat from Titan's core had subsided, but in the control room, the atmosphere remained dense like a block of steel. Red warning lights blinked and then gradually extinguished, leaving behind a peaceful pale green glow. The ventilation fans resumed their steady rhythm, like the breathing of a tamed beast. Ethan Cross collapsed into a chair, his hands covering his face. Salty sweat streaked down his wrinkled cheeks. For the first time in years, he revealed exhaustion, not from Titan, but from the pride within him that had just been crushed by Titan. Ryan approached Emily, his face pale, voice trembling. I didn't think... You were right. I was wrong. Emily said nothing. Her gaze was no longer angry, just quiet, like water after a storm. She knew Titan didn't need apologies, but humans did. Lucas placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder, a silent gesture of forgiveness. The important thing is, we were in time. Thanks to her, and the truth everyone feared to see. In the subsequent emergency meeting, Ethan Cross stood up. His voice no longer carried its usual firmness, but the sincerity of someone who had misplaced his trust. I underestimated the small voices, because I thought data was everything. But Titan doesn't speak in data. It speaks in breaths, in small cracks, and only those who dare to listen can save us all. The room was utterly silent. In that silence, everyone understood. It was no longer just Emily's or Lucas's story. It was a lesson for all of Omega 9. Safety isn't just about data. It's about responsibility and humility. When the meeting concluded, Emily was the first to leave the room. She didn't wait for anyone to pat her on the back, didn't wait for anyone to call her a hero. She simply slung her old backpack over her shoulder, her eyes still bright and calm. Ethan watched her small figure, a thank you unspoken. But in his heart, he knew he would never forget that small voice. The voice of someone who dared to go against the crowd, dared to place truth above all else. Lucas walked beside Emily in the long, narrow corridor of Omega 9. Their footsteps echoed softly. steadily. "Will you stay?" Lucas asked, his voice low but earnest. Emily gently shook her head. "No, I don't stay for recognition. I only stay long enough for Titan to no longer be angry." Lucas asked no more. In the yellow light, he understood. Some people are born to walk away, not for glory, but because Titan always needs someone to listen. Before leaving the plant, Emily left her old notebook on the control panel. The last page had only one line. Safety doesn't lie in laughter, but in humility before Titan. Titan had fallen silent again. And in the hearts of everyone at Omega 9, one question lingered. Will we listen, or wait for Titan to roar once more? At that night, Omega 9 was enveloped in a rare stillness. No more sirens, no more flashing red lights. Only the steady hum of ventilation fans and gentle warm steam wafting like Titan's slow, tamed breath. In a narrow corridor leading down to the basement, Emily and Lucas sat on old iron steps. They didn't talk about the incident, didn't mention glory or regret, just silence, listening to Titan's murmur like a metallic lullaby. Lucas looked at Emily, his voice soft but firm. "You know, I used to trust the system completely. I thought just looking at the data was enough. But Titan, it's not on the screen. It's in its breath." Emily tilted her head, her eyes softening. "We don't fight against Titan. We just learn to listen to it. And listen to those considered the smallest people." Lucas nodded. He placed his hand on the hot steel railing, as if touching Omega 9's life. "Thanks to you, I learned that. Silence isn't safety. Silence is just Titan waiting for someone patient enough to understand it." A cold breeze swept through the door crack, carrying the scent of dust and metal into the night. Emily pulled her old backpack closer to her chest, her gaze distant. "Will you return to the control room tomorrow?" she asked, her voice as steady as a daily conversation. "I will." Lucas smiled lightly. Titan still needs someone to keep its rhythm, but no one will be considered invisible anymore. Emily smiled. The night was peaceful, and in that peace, they no longer feared Titan, because Titan had been soothed by human patience and listening. Outside, the towering chimneys still emitted thin white steam into the night sky. But tonight, it was no longer threatening, just a steady breath. A peace achieved thanks to those who refused to stay silent when Titan began to whisper. Lucas turned to Emily, his voice deep but warm. "Thank you for not giving up, even when everyone told you to stay silent." Emily merely shook her head. "There's nothing to thank. We didn't do it for anyone. We did it for Titan, for those unseen." In the yellow light casting down the steps, they sat side by side, needing no words. Because tonight, the most peaceful night at Omega 9, Titan had understood human respect.